From whom did the Indians borrow the numbers? Or the so-called Arabic numerals, which are supposedly Indian, turn out to be Eurasian runes? Part 1. Having heard such, perhaps you will decide that another holy fool, or as it is now fashionable to say a freak, decided to hype on a false sensation, and you will be right. Or not. Well, whether you are right or not, you will find out only after listening or watching to the end. And I, in my turn, promise you a fascinating journey into the past, and that my conclusions will be fully grounded on facts and common sense. I am not chasing any frivolism or pursuit of sensation. Alas, this is not in my nature. I haven't even the slightest desire to oppose apologists for the traditional established knowledge, relying myself only on shaky assumptions. Agree, it is always difficult for people to change their minds, especially when it comes to global conceptions and misconceptions. But the fact is that there occurred to me a more logical picture of when, where and how it happened that the Turkic runes, which conveyed the phonetics of the Turkic languages, gradually evolved into what is now called the Arabic numerals, with the eternally emphasized clarification that they originally used to be the Indian ones. No, you can exhale. The nomads did not invent numbers and counting as a phenomenon for all of humanity, while the others were just getting down off trees, as you could hastily and mistakenly anticipate the freak's train of thought. Counting has probably existed among many ethnicities of the world since very ancient times, and for some, even from prehistoric ones. Moreover, some of them, for performing calculations, also managed to acquire their own fixation systems. However, over time, it was the Eurasian runes that formed the basis of the modern digits, but in the Eurocentric historiography, they were called Indian, either by mistake or with political intent. Well, people always fight, and if not with weapons, then with something else, and vanity is no exception. Okay, let's start with their story. The familiar symbols of digits, which once were globalized in the modern world, have become so commonplace that the vast majority of people would never think that their modern form is actually the result of a long journey and eventful period in which they might have been periodically modified or replaced by other forms. Certainly, thanks to history lessons in some countries, people are still familiar with the Roman numerals, because it is still customary to record the chronology of centuries with them. By the way, another ethnic group also has similar analogues. Who do you think has? The Chuvashes. Was it unexpected? Initiates know that the ancient Sumero-Akkadians, the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Chinese each had their own unique and original system for recording numbers and processing calculations. There are quite a lot of unique numeral systems, even among seemingly primitive peoples. However, to begin with, I will justify that it is wrong to consider India the birthplace of the Arabic numerals, even from the viewpoint of the already, so to speak, generally accepted facts on which the theory has been actually based. Firstly, the so-called Arabic numerals came to Europe relatively late, even rather late, only in the Middle Ages, and somehow, suspiciously, in a rapid way replaced some local analogues, of which for some reason are widely known only already mentioned the Roman ones. At the same time, the variants of recording the Oriental numerals varied in the inclination, degree of writing, in the length or direction of some curls, but on the whole, they differed little from the modern version of writing them, and any ordinary person is able to recognize in them a numerical sequence, rather than just an inscription in a language that has not yet been deciphered by paleolinguists. Secondly, from this it follows that the Arabic numerals came to Europe through hard work. To be more precise, the work of Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi under the title Al-Kitab al-Mukhtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wa al-Maqaballah. By the way, that great man, a native of Central Asia, as it turned out, at least cannot be considered the only original author of such a work, for he was preceded with a similar work by another Central Asian mathematician who, as noticed, was even more skilled in the science, and his name was Abd al-Hamid ibn Turk. However, we are not talking about the latter now, although in this respect he was prior to the first, of course, but both of them were contemporaries and probably knew each other in person, as there is historical evidence. However, now it is Al-Khwarizmi who is inscribed with golden threads in the history of mathematics as the founding father of algebra, and from his name the word algorithm is derived, a word that is so relevant nowadays, which once, either by mistake or deliberately, happened to be contributed to a certain mathematician algorithm, mythical like most of ancient Greek origin, the existence of whom is historiographically very, extremely doubtful. Well, the entire historicity of the so-called ancient Hellenic civilization and its figures has been causing more and more criticism among revising researchers, which is to be discussed somewhat later, separately. Thirdly, in general, calling those Arabic numerals Indian is completely stupid, if only because in India itself those numerals among various local peoples were written somewhat or completely in different ways. And identifying them among the ancestors of the Arabic ones is not an easy task. And really, if you have ever paid attention to the alphabets used by the ethnicities living in India, you have probably noticed that their symbols resemble very complex, sometimes elaborate ornaments. So, it is challenging to substantiate their gradual metamorphosis into those stops that are commonly called the Hindu-Arabic numerals today. Thus, in principle, neglecting the Muslimist and the Arabs like, oh, those sandy Bedouino Saracens literally redrew the figures from the wise and enlightened Indo-Aryans is extremely reckless, even from the viewpoint of the most ardent Eurocentrism. Wouldn't it be fairer to assume that those same very numbers, which in fact visually contain very little of Indian, could have been formally reworked by the Arabs in a form that was more convenient for them, and are not a direct copying of the Indian numerals? Accordingly, the intellectual work on straightening the lines and cutting off unnecessary squiggles and even replacing some Indian symbols with their own ones did definitely take place. That was a huge contribution for those times, being quite labor-intensive. So that ergonomic, well-formed and consistent decimal system of writing numbers was adopted in the same Arabic version. And in general, why merely Arabic? As a matter of fact, the Persians also used the Arabic script, and being geographically closer to India might have begun adopting the numbers before the Arabs. Whatever it is, in this sense a more or less semantic compromise is widely used in the English language scientific literature, the Hindu-Arabic numerals. Well, what's the point of this all, some would say? Didn't the author threaten us to prove that the modern digits derive from some sort of runes out there? Enough combing the ball heads, where are the proofs? A proof. That's it. So it's time to derive into this part. Who else but lovers of Bollywood would recognize familiar characters in the elegant ornaments on the movie screen? Here are the alphabets of some ethnicities living in modern India. Suppose that those peoples could initially use ready-made symbols for counting and calculating, and those could be alphabetic, syllabic or hieroglyphic symbols. Yes, such practices are traced in history: the Greek alphabetic system, Byzantine Empire Cyrillic numerals, Glagolitic, Abjadja, etc. To that matter, even during the digital boom of the 20th century, the pioneer programmers, in order to complete one byte, instead of inventing new digits for the 16-bit computation system within the developing computer architecture, just supplemented the decimal system with 6 more missing elements representing letters from A to F. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, A, B, C, D, E, F. And they did it in the era of information when polygraphic capabilities were already unlimited. However, in those distant times back, if someone still could find the use of the same symbol for both phonetizing sounds and at the same time symbolizing numbers inconvenient and confusing, then in this case people would inevitably strive to somehow modify existing ones or even invent something new. But at the same time, it is completely reasonable that the calligraphic style of the people in the locality, which had been developing for a long time by the moment, will be reflected in the digital symbols they were newly creating. Yeah, but sir, letters are just letters, whereas numbers… Look, the Sumerians did not use the same cuneiform constructions for numerics, just as Romans did not use letters. Couldn't the Indians have deliberately made their numbers so simplified in revenge for their sophisticated letters? Also, as an alternative, complex symbols that shared meaning with the numbers hypothetically could have gradually degraded into the current primitive squiggles, skeptics would say. To whom, though, I will have to appeal with the following. It is not obvious to people far from calligraphy art that simplification of writing in cursive can always be justified by physiology and kinematics of the human hand, vectors, tools, application, writing medium, consumables, etc. But extremely complex logical tricks will be required in order to explain why such truly ornamental characters could degrade into such simplifications. Now, let's see what the numerals of the peoples of India, probably recorded relatively recently, represent now or represented somewhere according to most textbooks and scientific works and as a result on Wikipedia. Here are numerals currently used in different Indian alphabets. Okay, from left to right. Hindu-Arabic itself, Devanagari, Gujarati, Gurmukhi, Bengali, Oriya, Telugu, Kannada, Malayalam, Tamil. As can be seen from the table, it is difficult to say what derived from what. The Indian numerals can, on the contrary, be explained as calligraphic metamorphoses from the Arabic derivatives. Of the Hindustani alphabets presented in it, only the first 3.5 rows resemble the modern digits. Whoa, remind me, one might object. But that's what they are. Well, here's my counter-argument. From the table, there follows that the first 3 verticals are Devanagari, Gujarati, Gurmukhi. In short, they were used by peoples living in the west of the Hindustani peninsula, approximately in the east of Pakistan and the south of Afghanistan. And that, excuse me, is no longer just India. And yet, the homeland of the numerals is not even there, and it will later become clear why. Just try to find stylistic and visual similarities between these supposedly Indian numerals and the alphabet in question. Samples of Devanagari, Sanskrit. Samples of Gurmukhi, Punjabi. These 2 candidates can be easily dismissed, despite the antiquity, universal historical fame and even popularity of the first. The compared samples of letters and numerals are so far from each other that there seems to be an abyss between them, really an abyss. If someone has a chance of being considered identical in form, it is Gujarati of the same name. It should be noted that the Gujarati alphabet seems to clearly be formed under the influence of several various alphabetic systems, including the runic one, and that is why it's so strikingly different from the previous 2 alphabets. But again, I have to reject it, because although its style does remotely resemble that of the numbers, yet nevertheless it will be blown out of the water by our next, this time real candidate. There may be 2 variants of Turkic runes in this table, Archon and Yenisei. As follows from the table, paying attention to the pair of the Hindu-Arabic numerals and the Old Turkic runes, it is clearly seen that the so-called Indo-Arabic numerals are nothing more than just handwritten runes, I.E. the runes adapted for the convenience of writing them by hand. And although not all the comparons coincide, nevertheless, in favor of the fact that they served as the basis for the Hindu-Arabic numerals can be said by the obviosity that the majority of the runes symbolizing numerals correlate with the initials of the Turkic words meaning the numeral titles themselves. So, for example, the runic symbol P, actually reminiscent of figure 1, corresponding to the Hindu-Arabic numeral, and at the same time Latin transliterate per, correlates well with the common Turkic per, Turkic perinci, perci, from which there derived Slavic pervi, pershi, as well as the English word thirst. Next, let's look at the following comparons pair, Hindu-Arabic numeral and rune meaning yek, Turkic yeke, which means 2. By the way, pan-European ones, in particular segundo in Spanish and second in English, are associated with this rune. And so on and on along the table you can observe similarities in form and content between most runes and the Hindu-Arabic numerals. However, as I mentioned, the table also contains a number of discrepancies, numbers 4, 7 and 9, which, however, can be explained by both adaptive transformation under the manuscript and by the subsequent late replacement of the symbols under the cultural influences of other peoples, where those runes in fact hid it. Besides, I cannot help but admit the possibility that the latter numerals could have derived from some other runes, or in general have a local origin for the regions under the research, including the European one. Even though I initially and finally rejected any connection between the Hindu-Arabic numerals and the arbitrarily selected symbols of the considered alphabets, nevertheless, it's still necessary to compare their initials by the analogy with those of the Turkic runes. Thus, if the ancestors of modern digits were invented by one of the peoples of India, then accordingly to the derivative initials we would use today something so artistic and expressive. Something like this. How cute! Wow! Very beautiful symbols, don't you find them so? That's beyond the argument. There's something sort of elven about them. And yet, I think many, especially school children, would agree with me that we are indeed all very lucky that the digits were not invented by Indians. It should be added here that such complex symbols became possible only thanks to the invention of liquid ink and writing paper, which generally speaks in favor of the later creation of those alphabets regarding those of runes. The process of writing, to be exact, rather hollowing out or scratching the latter on more rigid and unyielding materials, was much more labor-intensive, which did not allow the Danish font designers of runiform to create something more artistic. Well, so much the better. For those who find all that incredible, whom I haven't managed to convince that the modern digits were derived from runes and not vice versa, who still believe that they could have come to India from, say, the Middle East through Persia, I suppose to consider what digital symbols the Arabs had used before. Here is Abdagia by the Nabateans. These are the basic numeric symbols that the ancestors of Arabs had been using before the appearance of the Hindu-Arabic variant. As you've probably noticed, this comparative pair of rows also has visually close and at the same time strikingly different elements, which makes it impossible to consider them related. Being no expert on ancient Egypt, still I dare guess that just like the Arabic script could have developed on the basis of the hieratic script, one of the ancient Egyptian ones, so did Abdagia on the basis of some Egyptian numeric system, unfortunately yet unknown to me. And yes, experts in the field who happened to run across this information must have been wondering up to this moment, why didn't the author pay no attention to the basics of the Indian figures, the Brahmi numerals, instead of messing around with the various alphabets that can be considered the basis of the Indian numerals? Certainly I couldn't help but research it as well. Here is one of their earliest forms. As watchable from the table, this, as I appointed one of the various ancient forms of the Brahmi numerals, hopefully the ancient one, does contain some symbols that seem to be the predecessors of Hindu-Arabic ones. But those are only 5, 7 and 9. All the other variants of the Brahmi numerals available on the internet are more likely just speculations or not properly worked out scholarly pursuits on a subject that not so many people are involved in so far. But their amount will increase after this research of mine. Nevertheless, the Brahmi numeral certainly has some correlation with Chinese numerals, which is to be touched on in part 2. Well, if everything was really that way, then how come the Central Asia writing traditions reached India and the Middle East? Again, about all this in the upcoming part 2. And finally, I cannot ignore the topic of how history describes the process of penetration of the Hindu-Arabic numerals into the European subpart of Eurasia. From Wikipedia, we see that the main version is the penetration of figures through Gibraltar, from either Morocco or Algeria to Spain. Just in case, here I'm attaching a table with the so-called earliest versions of redepicting the Hindu-Arabic numerals in Europe, if this table is correct, in the perspective of their Hindu-Arabic lineage. According to the list in ascending order, we see that the earliest known fixation belongs to the 10th century, when the Europeans allegedly perceived the Arabic numerals in this form. But already from the 11th century and in ascending turn, those numerals begin to experience some transformations, the nature of which I believe is obvious to everyone. The main one is in the fact that Europeans used their calligraphic techniques when copying, precisely redrawing those figures, whereas no one concealed their artistic vision. As we can see, the orientation of the figures by angle was often completely arbitrary. Pay attention to figure 7, which according to the table was rotated 45 degrees clockwise and counterclockwise. Well, those European font designers, for unknown reasons, did a lot of work on figures 3 and 4. Was it due to the sacrality of figure 3 in the European culture of the time? I have no idea. Thus, the Arabic versions of the numerals in Europe began to undergo the same process as the runes once had in the Indo-Pakistani region and among the Perso-Arabs, which again clearly illustrates that the numerals can be called the Hindu-Arabic only in the sense that both options developed in parallel from the Turkic runes at the relatively same time. Still, skeptics perhaps have another argument against it. The Arabs, they say, did themselves call those figures Indian. But there is a significant objection to this too. The fact is that the peoples living in Hindustan themselves previously called their individual kingdoms differently, for example Bharata, but not India. That region as India began to appear in Persian sources during the period of its contest by the Turkics and Perso-Turkics. And from the information about the campaigns of Alexander the Great, also believed to be Iskandar Zulkarnain, I suspect those are completely different historical figures, this country was called Gangaridai, not India. All this means that India at the time of the spread of the numerals was already ethnically mixed, where Turkics, Persians and autochthonous Dravidian peoples were living together. So here, as you can see, not everything is smooth. Thus, calling the modern digits Indian only, or Arabic only, or Persian only, or Turkic only is not the right approach. Many peoples of Eurasia and even Northern Africa, let alone Europe itself, made some contribution to their formation. With this, here I'm completing my part 1 and look forward to seeing you in the second, in which I should remind you that I'll be explaining exactly how the runes, including numerals, came from Central Asia to the region in question.